سطر أنيس 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 بيس بيس أنيس
Hola, hola. Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenas noches. Qué emoción ver a tantas personas en este último miércoles de SOMA del año. Y el día de hoy está con nosotras cerrando el programa público Arshia Haq, quien es una artista de la India que trabaja con cine, artes visuales, performance y sonido, y es fundadora de Discostan, un proyecto colaborativo de colonial y una disquera que trabaja con la producción cultural del sur y el oeste de Asia, así como del norte de África. Su trabajo ha sido presentado en el MOMA de Nueva York, en el Centro Pompidou, en el Festival de Toronto, entre muchos otros, y actualmente es nuestra residente en SOMA. So, Arshia, thank you for being here. And
gracias a todos por venir hoy. Ha sido un placer residir aquí en SOMA y en esta increíble ciudad para los 3 meses pasados. Aunque he estado practicando la lengua durante este tiempo, todavía no estoy en el punto donde puedo dar esta charla en español. Así que me disculpo por el inglés. So the sound you're hearing is from one of the installations, which you will see some images from later in the talk. And I'll stop that here. Entering the psychedelic Islamic state from the Discostan dance floor to Sama and the sonic Ummah. So before I start, I wanted to explain a couple of the words that you see because they will keep reappearing in the talk. The psychedelic Islamic state is a play on the idea of the Islamic State, which became very notorious not long after 9/11, during the ascension of the conflict in Syria and the particular portrayal of the Muslim community. So the idea of an Islamic State that was not actually a nation, but something that was more psychological or ephemeral, and the idea of psychedelia, which is actually very present in many indigenous forms of Islam, not unfortunately known as widely as it should be, were things that I was thinking about. Sama is the idea of listening or the communal atmosphere of listening in usually spiritual environments. That has to do with the kind of shared devotional state that people will reach between a performer and the audience in these settings. And Ummah is the word for a community, specifically in the Muslim context. In this case, when thinking of it as a sonic Ummah related by sound. So I wanted to start with this image, which some of you may have seen. It's kind of one of the greatest hits currently of Islamic depictions, but it's also kind of an unusual one. Islamic art is often non-representational, which is why we will see a lot of botanical motifs, a lot of patterns, and often representation of figures, of animals, and things like this is discouraged. I myself grew up in a family that did not encourage visual representation. So my relationship to being a visual artist has kind of always ridden that line of kind of, paradox or complexity around the idea of what it means to represent something. What we see here is a scene from Islamic mythology around the Ascension. It's called the Ascension, the night of the Miraj. It's a night in which the Prophet Muhammad, who you see depicted on the creature in the middle of the frame, rose up to heaven from Mecca through Jerusalem, and got to see kind of the different levels of heaven, and it was called the night journey. And the creature on which he took the journey is Al-Burak, which is the figure that you see with the kind of the feminine head and the body of the horse, the winged horse, which has a lot of progenitors, from the Pegasus to the Sphinx, to figures in Assyrian mythology. And the prophet, of course, is not depicted. His features are not depicted because there's this idea of not being able to ever accurately represent the divine. So you can't see his face. And so this image is something that I've seen variations of since I was very young. And it fascinated me, kind of this idea and this tension of what it means to try and portray something that is impossible to represent. A few years ago, I came across the writings of the French Caribbean writer Edward Glissant, who wrote about the right to opacity. And I'll just read a little bit about what this idea means, because even though I came to it later, from when I started my work, it feels very central to some of the things I'm thinking about. So Glissant wrote about the right to opacity, which is the idea of the right to remain hidden, or the right to remain kind of resistant against visibility, as kind of a political tool, a post-colonial tool of resistance for communities that may not have had agency and were forced to expose their knowledge, their very images to occupying forces. And so through the idea of opacity, he questions whether it's possible or even ethical to make oneself legible across cultural lines. It's an idea against transparency, it's against translation. And so this is something I'm really interested in, because especially in this moment where we are in, where there is this kind of semblance of everything being visible, especially with the proliferation of the digital world, the social media world that we live in, where you can see everything, but very little is actually seen. This idea of kind of resisting against sharing things as a translator, or making everything kind of knowable as a form of resistance, is something that's very interesting to me. And he speaks a lot about unintelligibility, impenetrability, and confusion that characterize cross-cultural communication. And he insists that the right to opacity is an ethical and political claim. So coming back to this image of the Prophet and the Burak, there are definitely tensions in the idea of not being able to make something seeable, especially with, in this moment, questions of and kind of struggles around the ideas of hijab, around certain ideas of unknowability. But to me, it's actually kind of a very poetic idea if taken that way, as something that talks about how it is impossible to represent certain things, but it is a very human impulse to try. And also just kind of that fissure between what is impossible and what can be depicted. So the Burak came to being in the earliest representations are in the Iranian context. It's often gender neutral, but then through the evolution over the years became something more feminized. This is a representation from the Philippines, and she changes according to the aesthetics of the place where she's represented. So this is a South Asian representation of the Burak. And the other interesting thing about her is that even though she's a central figure in a particular event that's mentioned in the scriptures, she's actually not ever described in the Quran. So it's all kind of related through poetry and folklore. And this is also a very interesting area of exploration for me, is where the practices of the spirituality and faith are more indigenous, more related to local knowledge and to local poetry. And that's kind of where she lives. You'll see her on the backs of trucks in Pakistan. She's even been represented as a kind of avatar for an airlines in Libya. So there's all of these kinds of permutations. And so a few years ago, I had the opportunity to work in collaboration with an artist and a dear friend named Castles, who is a trans artist. And Castles had started working with the medium of ice. And they had done a work called Tiresias. And in this work, they had sculpted they had worked with an ice sculptor to create a torso of a very masculinized body in ice. And the work was to melt this torso with their own body heat over a period of several hours. And so a few years after that performance, they invited 3 other artists to work with the medium of ice, myself, Rafa Esparza, and Kiwan Thomas. And it was really captivating for me because I think because of this upbringing that I had that had been kind of anti-representational, the idea of working with a medium that was kind of going to disappear or destroy itself was really just compelling for me. So in this performance called The Ascension, which is based on this myth, I worked with an ice sculptor to create a version of the Burak in ice. And the performance itself was to try and gild, so to cover in gold leaf this whole figure before it disintegrated. So kind of working with this idea or this metaphor of what it means to try to represent that which cannot be represented. And so it was a really interesting process to try and do this. I didn't really have a model for how to work with gold leaf and ice. And it was just like a very interesting and precarious process to try and cover this whole thing and gild it and try to preserve something that was inevitably going to dissipate. So here's a really short video of the process of this. So the process of trying to gild the whole object took about 2 hours, working against the dissolution of the ice. and working mostly with gold leaf and with pulverized metal. And by the end, it was somewhat successful, although in the end it does fall apart. So as kind of a continuation of this exploration with ice and the 3 artists that had been invited, we moved forward. And also around this time, which was around 2018, was when ice, the agency of ice in the US had kind of become very prevalent, which had been around probably well before that, but it was kind of in the news in terms of, you know, all of the new detentions that were happening with migrants across the border. So the 4 of us worked with a column of ice where Castles, myself, Rafa, and I, and this was done under a different name, under which I perform sometimes for pieces with my body, work together to melt this column of ice collectively with our bodies, which happened at the Station Museum in Houston. And it was about a 7-hour process to kind of bring it down with the heat of our bodies. And it was really interesting for me because I hadn't really gone that far into physical performance. My background is more in experimental film, and as you'll see, more social practice. So it was definitely a very direct and profound way to enter that kind of work with the body. Continuing with the theme of ice, around this time also there were, this has been going on for a long time, but there were a lot of particular messaging that was happening around the election of Trump on freeway overpasses in Los Angeles, like this one, no ice, messages about impeaching Trump. And I just was fascinated by this medium of how you could reach millions of people anonymously and kind of, you know, intervene in these ways with these messages. And so I started putting up my own messages on freeways that were a little bit more oblique and I guess rooted in some kind of anarchistic impulses. And I was interested in what would happen with the same message if it was put up in this particular script is Urdu, which is my native language. Same message. It's obviously a font that's very similar to Farsi, a script that's very similar to Arabic. And the interesting thing that happened is that the English messages would be left alone, and these messages would get taken down within half an hour. I'm sure someone would call and be like, you know, what is this terrorist message being broadcast across the freeways of Los Angeles? But it was just a kind of signifying how even a particular script can invoke terror, can invoke fear. And around that time, I was invited to do a presentation by Lace, which is a gallery in Los Angeles. And I started thinking about how when I had first come to the US, I had been given a card because I was born in India. And so when you come as, you know, with the green card, I think they've changed it in the late 90s, but it used to be like when I came, you would be a resident alien. So there was just this idea of othering and really making strange anyone that was coming from another place to the country. And so I was thinking about the word alien and what it means. And the word for alien in Urdu, in Farsi, and in several other languages is the word ajnabi, which is also means stranger. So this was also around the time that there were all the conversations about the wall and the border wall and building this huge barrier between Mexico and the US. And it was really kind of almost ironic to me because in the US, there is a very strong tie between right-wing politics and right-wing religion. And so I started looking into messages from within Christianity that were more about inclusion. And I came across this passage from Matthew. And what struck me from it was this is when Jesus encounters the Pharisees and they welcome him as a refugee. And he says, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. So I kind of took that message and started to run with it, because right now in this moment, there is this idea of kind of excluding anything that is foreign, yet the central message of what many of the people that are subscribing to that ideology is actually opposite to that. So I thought of the signs of advertisements that are used on freeways and on billboards, which is kind of this like very gaudy sequined message that can be seen from miles away, and decided to make a sign that was basically that message from the Bible in both English and Urdu. That became a performance called Ajnabi Milan, which means the union of the strangers. And I can play you a short documentation of what that was.
اللهم اغفر لحينا وميتنا وشاهدنا وغائبنا وصغيرنا وكبيرنا وذكرنا وأنثانا اللهم من أحييته منا فأحييه.
So what I was thinking about with this performance was kind of disrupting the space of Hollywood Boulevard, which is, obviously the main strip where the Walk of Fame is, all the stars, kind of where the dreams of a lot of the world are created through the film industry of America, and to create this procession or this parade of the ajnabis, or the strangers, the ones who don't look like you, the ones who are not visible, even though they're very present in the environment, to kind of just create this intervention in the street. And the procession was accompanied obviously by drummers who were playing protest rhythms from South Asia, as well as we had a soundtrack that had everything from celebratory wedding rhythms to the songs of funeral processions and everything in between, kind of a whole landscape of kind of the oral existence of our communities. And it was just kind of this way to interrupt what happens on Hollywood Boulevard, which is very centered around the industry. And what was so interesting is that I had not known about the work of the amazing collective ASCO, which is, I'm sure many of you know of them, a Mexican-American collective from the 70s. That did a lot of interventions, including these walking murals. And just learning about them after this has been really influential for me, because they would intervene in these ways of kind of surreal juxtaposition with what was happening, both kind of questioning the dominant art world, which was mostly run by white interests, and also coming up against certain mores or conventions of Chicano identity. And also it's just something that I have always been really drawn to, is how to create work that is functioning outside of galleries, outside of institutions, in public spaces, in the streets, that can reach people in a larger way, in a more embodied way. I think really magical things can happen in these spaces. So this is another walking mural that they did, and it was just wild to me to see that there was kind of this channeling that was happening of something that had happened in LA several decades earlier. And so yeah, it was somehow a spirit that was continuous. The entanglement with Hollywood Boulevard, this is kind of just an aside, an earlier performance. I'm also interested in kind of performing for no one, or performing anonymously. So a little while before this, I had decided to start going to Hollywood Boulevard as a Marilyn impersonator, as the Brown Marilyn, or Marilyn in negative. And I would just kind of go and just dress up and just be a Marilyn impersonator in the middle of Hollywood, which is very confusing for a lot of people. Here's me with some of my friends that I made. And Marilyn in negative also sang Happy Birthday, Mr. President, and during the inauguration of Trump, for in all of the languages of the terrorist people. So this was a few years before that, but it was kind of just a gesture, and that's something that I feel kind of drawn to, is working in ways that are just kind of, in progress, maybe for no audience that is related to the art world, or related to a specific institution, but just to kind of develop these projects for myself and for whoever is around me in that moment. So now I'm gonna transition to a project called Discostan, which I began in 2011. And this started in a moment So as I mentioned, my background is in experimental film. I made some experimental films. I decided to kind of take a break from making work in that context. But around that time, this project came into being. So the idea of Discostan, if you know the root stan means land or place. So as you've heard, Afghanistan or Pakistan or Hindustan. So this was kind of playing with that idea of belonging to a nation state. And this particular nation state was organized around the idea of disco, which obviously is the genre of disco, the classic genre from the 70s and early 80s, because everything arrived later to Asia. But also working with the idea of disco, because until very recently, even in India, we would call the club disco. Or like el disco instead of the club, which it's called now, and also the medium of the disc. The early icon of Discostan was Gugush, who is a really iconic Iranian pop star. And so this began as kind of a project that was really organic. I had been working in record stores since I was a teenager. I grew up in an environment, even though I grew up mostly in the US, where I was not able to listen to Western pop music. And so my whole world was Bollywood and spiritual music from India. And that was really the canon for me. So I was kind of starting from a place where a lot of times I heard covers of songs in Urdu or in Hindi of really well-known Western rock songs. And I started kind of collecting this archive, working in the record stores since like the late 90s. And the idea again of Discostan was poking fun at the idea of belonging to a certain citizenship. So this is actually a still from a Syrian film called Al Hudud, which means the border. And basically it's about this guy who's trying to cross the border and he doesn't have a passport. And then there's Eastistan and Westistan, which really points to the irony of a lot of post-colonial delineations of cartography. The Middle East, for example, is a term that I don't really like to use because it's middle of what, east of what, it's just an arbitrary categorization placed on a whole region based on an outside spectator. So our maps are not in English. And originally the project was really, it started obviously with my region, which is South Asia, subcontinent, India, Pakistan. And then I just started to kind of make connections organically in terms of words that were shared between, for example, Turkish psychedelic music, or we have, maybe not surprisingly, the same words for love, friendship, enmity across many of our languages. So there was definitely a nostalgic look back at a particular era of musical production from the Swana region. So Swana is a term that I do use more, Southwest Asia and North Africa, kind of encompassing between Morocco and, let's say, Bangladesh. Regions that are tied together by a very rich pre-colonial history of trade and also post-colonial trauma. This is the first record that kind of was the foundation of Discostan. Suparuna, who she's a Bangladeshi singer who sang both pop songs and devotional songs, which is also a very interesting kind of hybridity for me, which a lot of musicians embraced, both of those worlds between the secular, the profane and the divine. And also, I think I got this cassette when I was 4, and I was living in India, and just this image of this woman who looked like she could be from my family, but at the time was very futuristic and also had this command of the microphone was really compelling for me. This archive has expanded over the years to all kinds of things, including Turkish psychedelia, Libyan funk, all kinds of folk recordings from the region, film soundtracks, Afghan cassette tapes, field recordings of devotional music, children's soundtracks. This is kind of one of the central kind of pieces called Disco Diwane, which was a song recorded, I believe, in 1982 in Pakistan, or actually it was recorded in the UK, which that's a whole other history of that exchange culturally between the UK and South Asia. I actually heard this song maybe like 3 weeks ago at Patrick Miller, and I was completely blown away. It came out of nowhere in the middle of a set of disco, and apparently it's a song that has been well known in Mexico for a while. And I also found a copy of the same record, which was distributed in Mexico in the 80s. So if anyone knows the story of how this became popular here, I would love to talk to you afterwards, because I'm trying to figure that out. But it also became really clear that the space of nostalgia was a dangerous space to be in, especially for places that are politically embroiled and under attack. The idea of nostalgia of some kind of golden age of culture that was in the 70s have been used to justify cultural and physical wars and genocides over and over in the Swana region. Before the intervention of the US in Afghanistan, for example, there were widely circulated images of air hostesses in Kabul wearing mini skirts. So now we need to go in and liberate the country. And so it became really clear that nostalgia itself was not a safe place to be in. And so it led to kind of like more ideas of intervention, glitch, interruption, and also in the musical content of the night to work with more kind of producers that are reinventing and re-envisioning the archive rather than just reproducing it. There's also been like a very political aspect to Discostan, which is mutual aid. Being in diaspora, for me and for the community that I have been lucky to be a part of, it's very important to kind of not just source from certain cultures, but also to continuously create a circuit of assistance where we can, because there's always a part of that part of the world that is burning down. This is from a party for Syria, early radio Discostan flyer. I'm just going to skip through. It's had a lot of different iterations. There's been podcasts where we had a writer who had gone to the Uyghur region of China, and someone had given him a USB of songs because they're not allowed to produce music or play it publicly. So a lot of the music is being recorded in basements. So to bring the music back and broadcast it here. I'm just going to skip past this. We started a record label during the pandemic with this amazing release that was a crossover between Pakistan and Britain in the 1984 synth pop record, and a story that you can also listen to more about. And we also have a party here in Mexico. If you're here, you're all invited to come and join us. So shortly after starting Discostan and having been disconnected from making work in a formal way, I decided to start to go back and visit the shrines of India and Pakistan. The shrines are Sufi shrines. Many of you have maybe heard of Sufism. Sufism is obviously the most visible or known symbol is probably the whirling dervishes of Turkey. But Sufism for me is generally a practice of of Islam that is very localized. It's very different in every region. There's many different schools of it. The saints of Sufism often were social justice warriors, which is why many of them were itinerant. They translated scripture and holy knowledge into local languages so that people could access it without being mediated by someone that spoke Arabic. They were very syncretic, so they often integrated practices that were indigenous already to the communities across which Sufi Islam is spreading. So for me, this has been kind of a counterpoint to the general narrative of Islam that we've seen, especially since 9/11, which is like Mecca Islam, in my opinion, a particular very sanitized version that is very aggressively being disseminated across the world. And so these shrines are often sites of resistance. They welcome all kinds of bodies. They're sanctuaries for often queer folk, women, and places where people can be embodied like women and practice their relationship to religion through music and through physical movement, which is something that you don't often see in the mosque. So I went there with the intention, I went there a few times, both to Pakistan and India, with the intention of making a film. And I encountered a lot of embodied practice, a lot of movement in trance, both in men and in women. And I started work on a film which has not been fully shared due to a few reasons, which I will tell you in a second. But here is some of the footage that I gathered during that time. And the first character that you see is a healer, a very wise old woman who has been living at one of the shrines in rural Pakistan for decades, since her birth, who has visions. You see one of the shrines where the singers sing in falsetto because the particular saint associated with that shrine wrote in the feminine voice because he believed that women carried the greatest burden of oppression in society. So all of his poetry was written from the perspective of a woman.
ये आवाज से उनके साथ ताल्लुक है जो बात ये आवाज से उनके साथ ताल्लुक है जो बात पूछती हूँ वो बता देती है जो परेशानियां में होती है किसी को वो परेशानी वो बताते हैं तो मैं कर देती हूँ वो ठीक हो जाता है ठीक ये चीज कोई खुदाई आवाज है वो जो गुफ्तगू है ना मेरी और ख्वाजा कल्याम बाजी वो इसराइल खुदाई है खुदा कर रहा है बात कर रहा है
वो मेरी आंखों देखी कहानी है कि मतलब जैसे ही उसको आ जाता था जिन, तो उसके बाल जो बंधे हुए थे ऑटोमेटिकली खुल गए थे। फिर हम जो भी उससे सवाल पूछते थे वो बिल्कुल सही सही बता देती थी।
कुछ लोग कहते हैं कि जो भी यहाँ आए दरगाह पे वो हकीकत ढूंढ रहे हैं, और कुछ कहते हैं कि जो भी यहाँ आए वो हकीकत से भाग रहे हैं।
सीने से लगा सीने से लगा के मुझे दीवाना बना लो। सीने से लगा के दीवाना बना
So this was a film, as I mentioned, that I was working on that was not finished, and is something I'm still developing because I found myself in a curious position as someone that is inside and outside, obviously being someone that speaks the language, that has some direct connections to these communities, but has lived outside and inevitably is coming in from a different perspective, which gave me a certain amount of access, especially because I was alone. And so they were just kind of, a lot of the communities that I was interacting with were like, there's this strange woman with a camera, but whatever, like, we don't really know what she's doing. And there was a certain degree of engagement, but it felt in the end somewhat extractive to me. And I am really strongly against ethnography. And so for me, there's 50 hours of footage from these trips that I am still trying to kind of work through and understand how you can work with kind of this entrance into communities in a way that is not exploitative. So in the interim, there was an album of field recordings that was released on a label called Sublime Frequencies that was mostly song I did leave with was this idea of kind of inclusivity in spaces and this idea of sama, this shared environment that is created in these very embodied spaces of worship. And so I was kind of thinking about how you could bring this back into the space of, for example, the club for our communities. And that led to kind of the integration of more ritual within the club space, more performance. This was a very early communal altar that was built for Nowruz, which is technically the Persian New Year, but is celebrated everywhere from Syria to Pakistan. And an altar is created that has 7 symbols with the letters seen that are related to fertility and the renewal of spring. We had to introduce our own intervention into that. Usually it's particular texts of Iranian poetry. This led to listening rooms of various iterations that were kind of thinking about the environment that I had been in. And then also the figure of this kind of visible, invisible came back into the party itself, where we had an event for the night of Miraj, which is where we began the night of the Ascension, with a queer dancer who was portraying the Burak, a performance artist who created a wonderful installation of all the presidents for us to dance on, and a house and ball kind of idea led by Iranian designer Hushidar Mortezai. Lots of film installations that have happened in the space. So the club space is really interesting to me because it is about pleasure, and there is liberation in pleasure, and it's also a very liminal space where a lot of experimentation can happen that wouldn't necessarily happen in the white cube. So I'm just going to play a short video that's just some raw footage of a night in Discostan. It's really hard to represent a space like that in a video, but I'll just kind of finish with a couple of more recent works that somehow have, I guess, become feminist works. But if I think of feminism, it is outside of the context of Western feminism, which we can talk more about over MSCal if you like. This is a poem that my mother would like to recite me. which has to do with post-partition. It's not super well known, but the migration and the partition of India into Pakistan, Bangladesh was one of the most violent modern migrations, especially for women. So I was thinking about the haunting of this because it's something that's still not spoken about. We just had the 75th anniversary of this partition that was randomly decided by a man in England who drew a line on a map without ever having been to the land that he was dividing up. So I was thinking about this haunting that happens intergenerationally when history is not discussed, especially an extremely violent history, which the survivors of the time still, like the last of them are dying out and they don't really speak about. So I created an installation with this poem and working with the throats of women from both sides of the border, from India and from Pakistan, thinking of those particular lives that were not documented in a particular, basically, ongoing massacre that happened. And I was also thinking about the display of artifacts from South Asia that often happens in Western contexts, in ethnographic settings, especially of jewelry, which is often handed down matrilineally between grandmother, mother, and daughter. It's kind of an unspoken history. So when these things are wrested and displayed, there's a particular violence that happens. So these were casts of women from both sides of the border that were gilded, displayed in the manner of jewelry in ethnographic museums. When people entered the space, they were asked to remove their shoes, so they would be engaging with this kind of dirt on the ground, which for me was a little bit about disrupting the cleanliness of an institutional space, which often erases a lot of violence of objects that are displayed there. This is another iteration of the piece. I'm gonna skip past this stuff. And another recent work dealing with the history of sexual violence in Indian cinema. So this was a film in which I took scenes of sexual assault, which was a constant in films from the 80s and 90s in Bollywood, and bleached out the body of the woman in the frame by frame. Which is a very laborious process, and also it ends up being kind of a horror or pulp film in a way, which I will not share at this moment. And then this recent and ongoing body of work, kind of exploring the idea of interior journey in Sufism and the different stages. So again, coming back to this idea of not being visible, not facing the camera. So this is a series of self-portraits. This is one and the second of 6 that will be completed around different stages of the journey in the idea of Sufism, this being initiation and this being annihilation of the body. And I will end with this last piece that I was invited to do at the height of the pandemic, where 80 artists were invited across the US to choose messages to write above detention centers and jails across the United States on Independence Day. So my message again was going back to this word azadi, which means freedom in Iraqi and Kurdish, in Farsi, in Urdu, in several other languages. It's often the rallying cry of resistance movements. And to put it in both English and in Urdu, that feared script, that terrorist script across the sky, above a detention center in Orange County was just really an amazing thing to be able to do. And so the message would go across the sky and then disappear. And we see the word azadi in the most recent kind of struggles of women in Iran, women, life, freedom, azadi. So I will stop there. Thank you so much. Or does anyone know why Disco Tijuana came to Mexico?
In English? Yeah? In English is okay? Okay. How is your relation? Well, I understand you have many disciplines in your body of work, but how is your relation with film? And especially with the techniques regarding film, I would like to ask you if you experience with analog film, or is that any part of your interest?
So before I studied film, which I studied for my master's, experimental film, I was studying comparative literature. And I had a lot of theory that was given to me, a lot of post-colonial theory, but also a lot of colonial thinking. And by the time I was done with that, I really didn't want to engage with language. So I was really interested in how I could work with images in a way that could reach people without language. So I went to study experimental film at CalArts, California Institute of the Arts. So yeah, my beginnings were all analog, Super 8, 16, processing film in the bathtub, cutting it and taping it by hand. So yeah, that's kind of where I started. And I was a purist for a while with that, but then I kind of also realized the possibilities with going into more digital realms. Yeah, I was thinking we can maybe take a little break, have a little drink. If anyone wants to hang around, maybe I can play some music for you all in a little while. Oh, a question in the back. Yes, thank you for being my promoter. Yeah, it's on December 9th, a week from Friday. It's the first time the party will happen in Mexico City. It's in collaboration with Noche Negra, which I'm sure some of you know, which is based here in Mexico City and all vinyl. So it will be a new experiment for us as well, because usually we collaborate with people from a particular geography, but there's a lot of connections to be made. And yeah, it should be next Friday. It will be mostly music centered, so not performance art or any of the usual interventions that will happen, but we hope that we can do that sometime in the future here.